Hello and welcome to episode 51, the season finale of this Chrome hardening CIS benchmark series. So we have covered a grand total after today of, I believe, 98 different settings. So by default, most of these are not even configured, and we review in this series why they're important, the kind of disruption you might expect, but ultimately, typically, advocating for what CIS recommends to do here. Per the usual schedule, we do have Chris Lair from CIS Security joining us. I'll be introducing him here in a minute, but let's kick off with a little housekeeping on Senteon's side and get my screen to full screen. Awesome. So some things coming up in the background. Senteon is part of the Pitch It program hosted by ConnectWise. Just gave part one of my two-part pitch yesterday, and tomorrow via the channel program, Senteon is presenting on kind of the product and feature side as opposed to maybe the business side. I'm really excited to do that alongside all of our community. Outside of that, we're also hosting a webinar with Jared Brantley on automation, right? So there's a lot of talk about automation, only way to succeed. You'll be left behind without it. But what is automation? What's the difference from task automation, process automation? So we'll be talking about that with Jared tomorrow, actually. Senteon is also a sponsor of Can ITCon, so catch us out in Canada next month. I'll also be making an appearance with some friends over at CornCon out in Iowa. Extremely excited about that. And all of these webinars can be found straight on our website. For the recaps, you can catch them all here. And we did just launch a blog, so you can also read about the post-episode content and see about it there. Outside of that, our webinar viewers are welcome to create their own free Senteon account by clicking this login button, and they'll be able to get access to our freemium to where they can see all of these settings as presented by CIS, where they map across regulated frameworks, and most importantly, what the hell these settings are. So you can see the pathway, the description, rationale, and impact, as well as the machine key when applicable. So this is all of the information you might need to talk about how this setting relates to a framework, why it's important, and present why hardening matters. On top of that, you will get the added benefit of being able to do report generation. This is a simple gap assessment to see where you currently sit against the regulated frameworks. And if you did choose to give Senteon a shot, we not only tell you what's wrong, we fix what's wrong. That's the biggest difference between Senteon and a scanning tool. We actually perform remediation. All right. That is the overview and the housekeeping. Let's kick off with the episode. So, man, Chris, I mean, we've got to know each other for honestly 4 years. We just didn't really know it at the time, right? Because you were part of the market research for Senteon. And when I got to catch up with you at CompTIA CCF, I think I caught you a little off guard, right?
Oh yeah, but that happens, right? So, but yeah, that's exactly right. It's kind of crazy how those things happen. I mean, 4 years in our lives is, especially for you, young chap. That's a big part of your life, not as much as mine. But yeah, but I'm happy that we have known each other, whether it's indirectly, unknowingly, directly, or knowingly, for 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal to reference that. And that's why I wanted to call it out to start, right? People like Chris are very prominent in this world. And I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit with your forensics and IR background. But you very likely get hundreds of LinkedIn messages a week, whether it's cold emails, cold messages. And you do have to sift through that and outline who is, someone I actually need to talk to, who actually needs help, or who's just trying to sell me something. So shout out to you for giving Senteon, myself, a chance to do some market research with you. Obviously, the things you said in that meeting led us to building the thing we talked about.
No, it's cool to be a part of that part of the process. Yeah. So a little bit about my background is I kind of grew up in financial services, really more in the banking space. So what I tell people about that is, you know, it's a very regulated space, and you were forced to not only do the right things from a security perspective, you had to prove it time and time again. And so, I mean, security was always at the forefront. And even though at one, early on, there wasn't really, quote, a dedicated security department or security team, it evolved to become one. In IT, I was directly responsible for it. And at the end of my that part of my career in banking. Unfortunately, I spent 80% of my time dealing with compliance stuff and security stuff and signing off on all sorts of reports and everything else. So, yeah, you need to prove it exactly. And so that's what I did. And then I jumped in. So I jumped into the other side, the dark side of buying things, selling things. Actually, I was Solace's first client back when it started 21 years ago.
And
And
really quick, high level, what is Solace? What did you join?
so Solace started as a cybersecurity advisory company for banks, mainly community and regional banks around the country. Basically, today, what you would think is VISO, that's what Solace did back then.
Mm,
And even though that wasn't the term. There's a lot of banks starting up. There's a lot of bank acquisitions and mergers going on, and so the banks needed that type of work done because they didn't have nowhere to turn or anybody else that was kind of experts in it. And so that's what we did. About 6 years into that, our banks kept telling us we should do IT as well, and we told them a bunch of times
no.
no. Uh, but we ended up giving into the pressure and on the MSP side of our business and the security side of the business, and we did not blend those two, meaning they in the same office space but separate teams, separate lines, and all that kind of stuff because we still believe in that kind of that separation of duty aspect of it. And also, banks were being regulated, and they'd always have that question, so we could demonstrate that. Again, we had to prove it, and so that's what we did. Uh,
Now, I have so many notes on that piece, and want to shout out another webinar that at ChannelCon when we ran into each other, you said you'd be up for, but working with Eric Taylor to talk about his IR side. He touches on forensics, but I know you're more forensics, but you touch the IR side. So I know that separation of duties is extremely important to him, and it'll be cool to have both of you on a panel, kind of talking about your expertise, even though it might differ on some aspects, which I'm excited to really explore.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that does sound like an exciting topic and one that I'm perfectly comfortable talking about, right? Because deal with it all the time. Right before this meeting, I was out there. We're just kind of discussing a very kind of tricky case where we have a situation with a client who has a very tight relationship with a customer, and
Mm-hmm.
the customer is wanting to know a lot of detail about what happened, and that's not easily done. You sacrifice a lot of confidentiality and stuff, which would be great when we talk about that later topic.
I
Uh,
know. I want to dive in so bad. I'm taking notes on the side because this is stuff I want to do as our pre-interview so I can make that outline. But
yeah,
yes, kind of keeping to the scope. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about settings.
yeah.
You
And
did
so
mention
that's
one thing.
yeah.
One thing I really want to dive into was, you sounds like you have an entrepreneurship background. Is that fair, or have you always just
Well,
been a
I've been
leader at
kind
your
of
orgs?
been on both sides, right? So, work for people, work for companies, ranging from 750 employees up to 25,000, almost 30,000 at USAA. But being here, it's more of an entrepreneurial journey, and it still is, even though today. So we dropped we sold off the MSP part of the business, and now we specifically focus on incident response and cyber, and we're owned by a cybersecurity insurance carrier out of London called CFC. So, but the reason I tell people my MSP background because it's important because I
Mhm.
lived it every day of my life and understand and appreciate and MSPs and what they do, and that's why I know a lot of what our audience out there is,
Yep.
and I kind of know what they. We go in there and say, turn all this stuff on and tell your clients to just shut up and deal with it. That doesn't work. So that's what I'm hoping to kind of share a little perspective today.
That's so funny. I am really excited for that panel because I already did my pre-interview with Eric, and you just said a lot of things that resonated with him. So it might just be a very much sounding board of agreement and resounding, and hopefully a lot of good takeaways for the audience. So very awesome. I do have some follow-up questions that I want to dive into, but given the format of the show, let's kick off with some of these settings. So if we can pull up the slide deck, very high level, you mentioned financial, regulation, MSP, to now doing IR. CIS benchmarks are going to be looking at the configuration level, how to configure a Windows device, a Mac device, an application, right? A lot of recommendations on how to harden settings. Is this something relevant in your today world or previous life?
Yeah, it's extremely relevant, and I would think in my prior life, having benchmarks and then building off of those benchmarks. So that's what we would do in the banking side. So we would leverage CIS benchmarks, build out our images back then. I mean, there wasn't as many benchmarks as there are
Right.
today. but we would do those things and then build on top of those. And that was very easy when an auditor or a regulator wanted to come in and understand why we did the things we did and how we did the things. We had it all documented, and we had this supporting reason, right? It's one thing to go out there and try to invent stuff on your own, but you have to invent all that stuff. It's much easier to say, hey, look, do something like CIS benchmarks or something of that nature. I can tell you the first bank I worked for, we had a hell of a time. One auditor would come in one year and tell us one thing, and the next year a different auditor would come in and tell us something else. And it just got old. And so, at that time we said, we're adopting ISO
Sure.
27001 as an example. So those guys don't, that's it. We're just going to adopt that. We're going to live by it. They don't have any way to argue out of it. So that's kind of my analogy and what I would build upon here with you and your clients to say, hey, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. You're not trying to create something out of thin air.
Right.
You're using something as this baseline to build off of. It doesn't mean you're going to live by it like gospel, but you're going to have something, and that's something, in my opinion, that's defensible.
That's the word I was gonna say. I was waiting for a break, and then I was gonna ask you because kind of saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go through all 1,000 settings, decide which ones matter to me, should be configured this way, should be configured that way." If an incident happens and you do have to go in front of a court and you got to justify how you came to these decisions, I mean, is saying that's what my gut told me defensible, or is following someone like CIS a little bit more powerful?
It's definitely more powerful because if you have to imagine the worst case scenario, if you did have to go to some type of trial or something of that nature, typically opposing, you're going to probably be on the defensive side of that.
Sure.
Most likely the plaintiff's going to bring in some type of expert witnesses. And so you need to be able to kind of know that they're going to bring an expert witness in. It's going to be very hard for an expert witness to poke holes in something that is as well adopted and well accepted as CIS benchmarks. So you're exactly right. It's going to make your life easier. And I think it's just again, why do extra work? Why
Yep.
do something that somebody's already laid the foundation for?
Yep. And you said one other thing with auditors will differ. I've had Kayla Williams from Devi. Oh my gosh, what is that company's name? Putting me myself on the spot. Why would I do that to myself? They are called Devo. That's what it is. The CISO of Devo, and they're CMMC regulated. I know she has the same auditor come back and back, so she really got used to the things they look for. When you're saying auditors will differ, is this because financial has different bodies, or they just have, it's not the same auditor every time? What can you elaborate more about that differ aspect?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it does. I mean, it can differ because of industry or size or whatever. It can also differ by audit firm, right? So a best practice is not to use the same audit firm. I think most people usually don't want to use the same audit firm 3 years in a row.
Oh,
It depends on if you're regulated or if you're a public company. Sometimes there's specific guidelines which you have to rotate. That doesn't mean you have to rotate the whole firm, but you have to rotate auditors. But it kind of comes down to this. So you have in the banking world, you have to be audited, and some banks have internal auditing as well as third party auditing, and then they have regulators as well. So if a regulator comes in, usually the regulator is going to review what the audit did, and then the regulator might have additional things that they ask for or whatever, or things of that nature. But really, it comes down to it is a human being. So, after I'm done with this thing and I walk out on the street tonight, there's going to be a bunch of auditors beat me up. But here's the deal: you have young auditors that are trying to make an impression upon their bosses, and then you have experienced auditors, and then and so on and so forth. So you get the young person in there that's just trying to find something because the last thing they want to do is do an audit where there are no findings.
mm-hmm.
So it's some tricky waters to it. I mean, you could do a whole session on auditing and Chris Lair's kind of secrets to dealing with that mess. But yeah, so that
Might
is
take
the
you up
deal.
on it if that's an offer.
I have dealt with, for example, an audit where the auditor used to be an MSP owner. And his kind of angle was this is how he did things. So this is the way everybody else should do things. And so really audits should be looking at, what controls you have in place and are you meeting those controls? It should be less about how and more about what. And a lot of times you'll get in there where they want to be very prescriptive about things and say, well, why didn't you do it this way? Or why didn't you do this? Another example would be there's an organization is being audited and they had seasonal workers, like people that just worked in the summertime.
Hmm.
So they would disable their accounts, and not only that, they would put them in a disabled OU. And the auditor's like, nope, you got to delete them. We're like,
Because they exist.
why? Because they exist. So, well, what are they going to do? Well, a threat actor could get in there, enable their account, moved it out of the disabled OU, and use it, and you wouldn't know. And I'm like, why would a threat actor do all that? It doesn't make any sense. If they're that into your network, that's a lot of extra work. There's a lot easier ways for them to do things than do that. Well, I don't care. This is just what I think. You know what I mean? So that's what you got to get into.
So the check boxes may not be as logical sometimes, right? It's not just a
yeah,
one
just
way to do things.
yeah, there isn't. Yeah, and sometimes they're just kind of black and white without any reasoning behind it. So, and I learned that the bank I worked with, actually, the chairman and CEO used to be a bank regulator, and he was really good at explaining things and walking through things like that, versus maybe my methodology is swinging the baseball bat. Uh, but sometimes you got to swing the baseball bat. But anyway, but that I learned a lot. I learned a lot from him and what he did there. So give him full credit. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, and again, it kind of comes down to how big but audit firms are. I mean, you got these
Hmm.
I got these audit firms that are tens of thousands of employees, and so you're a small little organization, and for some reason you're getting audited by a big giant one. You're probably not going to get the auditor of choice, so that kind of is a little painful too.
All the things that play a role into that, because
But
like you said, it's the human aspect. So everyone's going to do things slightly different, different standards, making a name, not making a name. That would be a very fun topic. So hopefully you don't get beat up on the street tonight when you go
yeah, they'll
outside.
just
But
speed hard. That's all they'll do, but that's okay.
all right, diving into Chrome hardening. So when we talk about browser hardening, we're talking about the configurations to allow certain things, disable other things. Is hardening the browser something that has been talked about for decades? Is this something new gaining popularity? Where have you really prioritized, or what's your experience with potentially hardening browsers?
So I think in the enterprise space, it definitely has been. But when you get down to smaller organizations, it's a brand new concept. It's very similar to MFA, right? I
Sure.
tell people I used MFA in 1999 to VPN in, but there's still some small organizations. That's a brand new term in the last 5 years.
Yep.
So I think the same thing comes down to browser hardening. But when it really kind of comes down to is when you start explaining people that the browser itself is probably the most powerful application interface
Yep.
that an end user can have. Remember, I say the most powerful software on earth is the RMM.
Yep.
But from in a user's hands, I think the browser is probably the most, especially in today's world, the browser is it. But then people, I think, a little bit start to get it. But as you're going to see here, there's a bajillion
There's
things
so
to
many.
do. Kind of crazy, right? But I think
It
that's
is. I mean, on Chrome, there's about 98, 100. On Edge, there's another 120. And on Firefox, I think there's a little less, like 70. But there's, in that example, that train of thought, if you can't restrict your business to just one browser, that alone is what, 300, 400 settings I just said you need to configure?
exactly. Yeah. So you're exactly right, and it's tough. I mean, it's very similar to what soda you like to drink, right? I mean,
What do you want
think
to call soda?
yeah,
You're Texas, so Coke,
uh,
right?
yeah, Coke, water, there's all sorts of terms, right? Yeah, Coke, but yeah, I mean, people have their like, I'm not, we won't paint it any other way. Edge works better with Microsoft 365 stuff. There's just no exception. Chrome works better with G Suite stuff. There's just nothing to do. And so when you got these people with their affection and what they do and
Yeah.
what they carry from their home back, that's how I work at home. This is how I want to work here. It's just a browser. So
Yep.
yeah,
It's just a
definitely
browser. That's such a good piece right there because that's what the end clients say, right? What's it matter? They all do the same thing. Why are you forcing me to use the one that looks different?
right. I think even if you said, hey, you can't use that Windows machine, you have to use a Mac or vice versa. I think as long as that person can continue to use the same browser, they're happy. But if you tell somebody they got to switch browsers, they're a little they're a
Yep.
little less happy in their life
I feel
after that
that.
conversation.
Yep. All right, we got 10 settings to discuss today, and I have a feeling some of these will go fast, others will might take a bit longer, but let's get into the first setting here. So this one here is going to be talking about allow or deny video capture, which CIS is going to recommend to disable, but I want to shout out how the slides are formatted here. In the bottom right, you're going to see a level 2. Level 2, for everyone who doesn't know what that means, is this is very likely to annoy or cause disruption to that end client, that employee level. And honestly, I think Chris is probably going to say a pretty good reason as to why this might annoy them, but maybe also why, from a security point of view, you may want to just overcome that. But explain this one for us, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the one that's always kind of interesting because people don't do a good job of just securing your cameras, right? So I think
Yeah, the
that's
camera
the hardest.
itself, right?
Yeah, the camera and video capture devices, but we're but it's really important. But I think that does get tricky because you take something like Google Meet or even the platform we're using right now.
Yep.
It must require that type of access. And so the goal is with any of these that we talk about is there's like there's doing making a decision, and then if you're not making a decision, being able to accept that risk and
Yep.
document why you accept that risk. And that's a conversation we have all the time. And so with any of these, that's what we're going to talk about. So with video capture, I always like to default to those emails that people get that are those extortion emails that say, hey, I've had access to your camera and I see all the bad stuff you do. I want you to send me $5,000 in Bitcoin to this address like that. Well, most of us can say, no, you didn't see that because we know. But if you have this stuff disabled, you know darn well they didn't have any access to
Right.
that.
And if a bad actor gets persistence to a device and we're allowing video capture, especially on this browser level, right? Like
Mhm.
when you're browsing the web and you don't know they're sitting in the background because they already have persistence, they can be screen grabbing, video capturing all of your actions, typing your password. If you click the little eyeball and you actually view the password, there's password capture, right? So you're exactly right with that fish, right? Once they get that access, this is just another medium they can take advantage of.
Well, and I also think too, it's kind of the accidental stuff that we don't realize, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, when I worked at USA as an example, they were very they were a very security focused, and they still are a very security focused organization, the best that I've ever witnessed. And they were very like when it came down to capturing stuff, taking pictures and everything, they were very clear on what you could and could not do and how you could
Yep.
and could not do. And in certain cases, those are designated people to do that type of stuff. But what they didn't want to do is they didn't want what they call their customers members. They did not want their members' information to be accidentally disclosed, and they took it incredibly seriously. So they didn't want somebody's camera accidentally being on and hitting somebody's in the background that may be member information, or hitting some intellectual property on a whiteboard, or even somebody else passing by in the hallways. Maybe it's a somebody speaking or somebody like that that just doesn't want people to know where they're at. I mean, there's a number of different reasons for this, and a lot of this has to do with, hey, look, there's the clear obvious stuff, but there's the accidental stuff that we're trying to
Yes.
avoid here. Accidental disclosure of stuff, because you don't like, because a lot of times people know that accidental stuff not going to come and haunt you tomorrow. It's going to come and haunt you 6 months from now or a year from now, and it's going to be very hard to track that back. So why even have that haunt you? Deal with this setting and try to figure out, and if there are exceptions to be made, document those and manage around those exceptions. Don't just
Yep.
default everybody to, okay, we'll just enable everybody because
Because one person needs it. All right, screw it. We'll just give it to everybody.
yes, one person needs it for 1 hour for one day of the month. Yeah, exactly right. And there are usually ways of working around this and stuff. And I would even argue in some cases, look, um, and then we don't need to get into this, but sometimes maybe like using the Google Meet app on your phone might be better than using Google Meet in the browser. So those
I've
are things you got to figure out.
There's things like that too, especially if your company doesn't give you a mobile work device, or maybe the work device
Hmm.
isn't as locked down, right? Some of the things you can't do on your desktop, you can still just pull out your phone. Is the interface that different? Is it that much of a hassle to submit a ticket to IT and get your computer and make the exception, or just pull out your phone?
Yes, and it's easy, and usually the interface is a lot better and quicker on the
Yeah,
phone.
mobile apps are sometimes better. It's annoying.
Now Google's going to beat me up, but I hate Google Meet. When I see a Google Meet invite, man, I just like, oh, come on. But
You're gonna get hit up by auditors, Google. You stay inside.
too many steps. Shouldn't be that hard. Yeah. So anyway,
Well, speaking of Google, we got our next setting here. Google, of course, is going to want allow user feedback because they're going to want to be able to pull various data, pull feedback when something potentially breaks, right? But CIS here is saying never allow user feedback to be able to send. I mean, don't I want Chrome to help me? Like, why do we want to block this?
Yeah, it's impossible to. I mean, I'm not gonna say it's impossible. I mean, it's probably technically possible, but from a cost-effective perspective, it's probably impossible to control what feedback
Yes.
they can get. And that's really the issue there is it's if you allow this, you basically are just saying, okay, I don't have it. I'm not afraid to reveal anything. You know what I mean? I'm not afraid to disclose anything. I'm basically opening up the kimono to these guys.
Yep.
And so anytime I see that type of stuff, even when I was messing with an update to Windows the other day, and it goes through and asks you all those questions about
There's plenty of those.
okay, all that stuff, right? Same type of situation here. I mean, yeah, you might think you're doing something for the greater good. Uh, just go ahead and round up your donation at the grocery store when you check out for the greater good. Don't do feedback in your browser. I
I
think
actually really like that because the way it's phrased, I mean, honestly, the way it's phrased, and we did do our webinar series to exactly what you're talking about on the Windows OS, and there's so many things that allow privacy just like this to potentially go to Microsoft, right? And we're talking about disabling all of it, including on the Chrome browser itself, right? You got to do both places. But what you said there, I've never heard before. When I read that, it does make me feel like when I say no, which I do say no, I'm hurting others, right? I'm now against the greater good, and that bothers me a little bit. Like I want to help, but at the
yeah,
same time,
but guess what? Guess who's making money off of it?
yep,
Not you.
not
So
me.
yeah, somebody's making of it because on the back end, those guys aren't doing it, and I'm really going to be upsetting a lot of people. But it's someone like donating blood. You feel great
Yep.
for donating
Sure,
blood, but there's a lot of people making money off the blood you donated. So I mean, there's a lot of people benefiting. Don't get me wrong. And
absolutely.
but yeah, but you see, I mean, my wife had to have blood transfusions when she had our twins, and I saw that bill for how much that blood was. I was like, man, can you just hook me up? I'm O
I'm
positive.
a match.
I'm
Just
good. But yeah, so that's it's kind of it's a different thing. But here, that's a little bit better because you're saving lives. You're not
sure.
saving any lives with user feedback. So just don't do it.
Yep. I love that analogy. All
And
right.
I'd love to find somebody that would come back at me with some kind of decision to accept this risk and why. So I'm sure there's somebody out
That's
there.
a good point. I mean, there's always exceptions, and obviously we're advocates at Senteon, managed by exception. Our learning mode literally tells you, hey, you can't handle this, you can handle this. That's the whole point. But the use case for something like this, like I would love for Google to release saying, hey, because of all this feedback, we were able to do this. Like that would be really interesting to see the actual output of why they want this.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm sure there's probably somebody out there that may be able to set up some kind of lab environment to where they could probably intercept that
Be
stuff.
cool.
But hey, that's for you. Anybody that has a hobby that wants to do that, have
We'll
it.
have you on the webinar.
I
All
will have
right.
it.
All right, next setting here, we get a little bit more technical here with this one, but controls the mode of DNS over HTTPS is set to enabled, making sure that DNS over HTTPS without insecure fallback. So this sounds like if we can't do it the most secure path, then we just don't do it at all. Is that what this is saying here?
Yeah, that's exactly what this is saying. It's saying, hey, look, and and there could still now this one there is
This
probably
is a level 2, and this is very much important to call out why this is a level 2.
yeah. So it is a level 2 because I mean it is possible that you have some things that you access that if you turn this thing on, it just won't do. I mean, that is possible. And I will tell you from the banking world, they got some weird, goofy old stuff that they still have to deal with. And it's incredibly painful. I mean, I know there's situations out there with banks, especially where they have to use older versions of browsers. And so you have to kind of restrict that down just to use that one thing that they
Yep.
need to do in place. But this is the thing. But I think in most cases, especially with small to medium sized businesses, turning this on is not going to cause too much grief because there's not going to be too many situations where they're using just really old stuff or sites are going to break or whatever the case may be. I mean, there was just, I mean, should I have it to throw it out there, but I just saw an article today where I think it was in Thailand, some university found a way to basically backdoor into the Windows operating system via DNS. So the point I'm making is DNS and DNS security. DNS was when it was created, no one was thinking about security back then, but um, it is like the almost like the heart of the internet. No one's going to
Yes.
lie about that. And so, treating it securely as much as you can and making exceptions in only extreme circumstances is a smart move.
And it's cool hearing your banking background. So this was an area I didn't have personally a lot of experience, but we do service quite a few MSPs who take care of the smaller banks, right? Credit unions and so forth, right? I learned that the Windows OS that might be out in like the drive-through typically is a lot less secure because they have to do a lot more access on that one, or maybe it just wasn't getting as many patches or the updates as the rest of the network for whatever reason. But that was interesting to learn about. The other thing I've gotten to learn about is these ATM machines, a lot of them run old Windows OS, whether that's XP, Windows 7, but that's another thing that even though it's an old OS, which yes, if you could update, that'd be amazing. Those old OSs still have these settings, or the majority of these settings, that you could lock down to make it a little bit better.
You can lock the heck out of them down, right? You can segment
You
things
can.
properly. There's just, a lot of times what it comes down to is those devices, they do exist. I mean, I remember a case, and I bring this up, and other things that I talk about is they had a fleet of trucks and they had their own gas pump. And the gas pump was driven by a Windows 7 machine. And the challenge they had was if it might have been the XP, to be honest with you, but it doesn't really matter. But the point is for them to upgrade that machine, they have to replace the gas pump. That's just not going to be right. But then my question was, well, do you really need it on the network? And they just paused and they're like, no, we don't. I'm like, no, you don't. Can you over there? Yes, we can. All right, just take it off the network. So there's always, and with ATMs, and believe me, I had ATMs and I had
Oh, you
machines.
did?
Yeah, I had like whatever, 300 and something
I didn't
ATMs.
know banks aren't responsible for their ATMs, or are
That
they?
depends. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So it depends on the size of the bank, but we were, yeah,
I didn't know that.
responsible for ATM. So, yeah, so we were responsible. There's a lot to them, right? I mean, they're expensive. It's not as easy just going out there and plopping in an OS and doing stuff. So, yeah. Now I think you can start to see less and less ATMs,
Oh,
yeah, especially with banks because there's just not the money to be made in ATMs anymore. I think you'll see them at bars and that type of stuff still, but
isn't it from the operation perspective? What do you mean money to be made? This
I
kind
mean,
of
so
throws me
you know,
off. I feel like ATMs is the robot of the fast food. Don't we want more?
cash. I mean, this is not people getting as much cash anymore, right? So,
Got it.
and people used to use it, and then the thing about it too is to make deposits. And so you made your money off. Not you didn't make your money off your own customers. You made off money off other people using your ATMs. Is mainly what you made your money off of. And it's just that many people aren't going around hunting for ATMs to get cash anymore. And so, and then people aren't making as many deposits anymore. And if they are making deposits, they're using their phone.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, so that's kind of the way it is. But you're right. All these things. There's a bunch of old stuff. I mean, you can walk around and sometimes see, uh, digital display. I mean, displays on the wall and digital signage
Sure.
and all that kind of stuff. Running old stuff. You can see the
Yep.
little screen in the elevator that's playing
Yep.
annoying commercials. Yeah, those running old OS stuff. So yeah, it
Yep.
happens.
All right. Let's hit over to this next setting. Ensure enable autofill for addresses is set to disabled. A big thing here I want to call out, like all these settings, we do talk about the security aspect, but we don't emphasize enough that privacy aspect all the time. I know we just talked about it a little bit, but again, autofill, that means it already knows before you even type it. Chris, why is autofill for addresses maybe a bad idea?
Yeah, I think well, number one is this one is purely a convenience thing. So if
Yes.
somebody's crying to me about it, I'm gonna get my little violin. Actually, I have it right here. But anyway, um, but I'm gonna play
You're
it for
not
you. Yeah,
kidding? You're opening up your drawer right
I'll
now?
open up my drawer because I happen to be in my other office today, and just because you mentioned it, I have my little
That
violin.
is so funny.
I have my little violin. So sometimes
When does it come out? You got to
uh,
give a story.
when there are MSPs crying about something they shouldn't be crying about, that's when I bring out the little violin. So, but anyway, let's. So with autofill, the challenge is if you use autofill, it's sometimes you're surprised at what it autofills.
Yep.
You're like, wow, I didn't even know it was capturing that information to fill that in. The other thing I'm always afraid of is the autofill is you just put in the wrong thing.
Yep.
And that's the privacy side of things. And you know, in other, especially European countries, privacy is at the forefront. In the U.S., that's not. Still to this day, I mean, there's no right to privacy, like
No.
you could argue constitutionally. I mean, it's just it doesn't that no one was thinking about it back then. And so this is the same thing as, again, something's capturing information to use it later. You don't know how it's being captured, how it's being stored. You don't know if there's going to be a browser vulnerability next month that may just be able to suck all that stuff out.
Yep.
I can tell you a lot, like we see cases where threat actors will get on people's machines and order stuff and create accounts and all that stuff. Well, when they're able to get there and all that information's already in the browser, boom, it just makes their job easier and makes them able to order stuff and do all sorts of fraudulent activity. So this one really is, yes, from a security perspective, you don't want that to happen, but you're
Yep.
right. We need to talk about privacy too. They go together, but they're not one and the same. We just need to be more careful about what we need to do. And believe me, man, type in your information, your address, city, state, and zip, and it ain't that hard of a thing
You
to do.
do it so much. I mean, if you move a lot, I can definitely empathize a little bit more. But I mean, typing my first last name, it's the fastest words that I type, and my address, same as that. I move quite a bit, but it gets not an inconvenience, not the worst, right? And let's pull up
Well,
the next setting here because it's very similar. But you said something as well, talking about it makes the attacker's job that much easier. One other thing that we don't really talk about is all of these configurations, or at least the majority of them, right? A Windows OS is about 15%. I don't know the exact number on the Chrome, but all of these are set to not configured by default. What benefit does the attacker have by knowing the configurations before they even get there, that lay of the land, right? If all of these are set to the defaults, what's that mean to the attacker?
Yeah, a lot of these attackers have processes. I mean, they follow those processes, and so when everything's as straightforward as this, their process works. They don't have to pivot. They don't have to think on their, you know what I mean? Things just work. And at the same time, there are tools out there that allow them to harvest this stuff. So they get into an environment. This stuff is not configured by default. It's very easy for them to run some type of tool or something to harvest that information. And this one's the one that really gives me. This
Yep.
one should be pretty darn obvious, man. Just don't do it. It's
Please.
just, yeah, just don't do it. I mean, I saw somebody the other day says, I had this credit card with me all the time. I don't know how it got used fraudulently. It didn't go out of my sight. Well, it's probably because you got something.
It's in my wallet. What do you mean? No
Yeah,
one can touch this.
yeah, exactly right. No, you used it somewhere. Is either, in your browser or restaurant got it. So that's usually two things. Again, back over in Europe, you go to Europe, they don't handle your card. Over
Yep.
here,
They
we
bring
give
it
it
to
to the
you.
server.
That's
Yeah, the
exactly
server
right.
takes off and whatever, right? And so, yeah, this is the same thing. This would be the same thing as you put this stuff in here. You're basically handing your credit card off to the server and coming back for it maybe a month later. So,
Yep.
yeah,
You've actually mentioned international quite a few times in this webinar, Chris. Do you go international a lot? Do you just keep up on international privacy laws? Where's this background coming from?
well, so for us, we do handle most of our cases are in the U.S. and Canada, right? And a lot of the situations are the same, but there are some differences there, and so understanding what those differences is part of our job. Our parent company being in Europe too, we have to
Mm,
cover for them, so we get in those situations. But also over here, you have companies that operate in other countries. So we may have somebody that's U.S. based, but they either have employees or operations or customers or something like that over there. So knowing that information and knowing what it is, but it's interesting. They're they're harder core about that privacy stuff, but they're
mhm.
less litigious, right? So over there, you do
Laura and
something
all that
wrong,
is what are
you're
you
going to
referring
get
to that?
fined. Yeah, you're going to
Mm,
get fined and all that, but you're not going to get class action sued. Over here, you're not necessarily going to have that black and white thing about getting fined by somebody, but you're going to get sued. So that's it's kind of weird how they
it's an
kind of balance each
interesting
other out.
comparison because it is different. That's a very good point I've never considered. But yeah, the international stuff has really been bringing Senteon a little bit to markets we didn't anticipate going so soon. I mean, even this morning from someone who um, I talked to like a year ago, randomly reached back out. He's like, "Hey, we're now being required to follow DORA. Does Senteon have a fit?" Right. So, I had to read up a little bit on it. And CIS, because DORA is so new, doesn't have direct explicit crosswalks. So we don't
Right.
have explicit reporting yet. But again, being that compliance focused security vendor, it's part of our job to know these international, where we fit in this, where we fit in the essential eight, right? So it's just part of this. And as you said, you're kind of on that side a little bit. So that's
You
why you
just
know
need
it.
to know. I mean, the data's handled like in India, which a lot, what like even this was a shock to me, just knowing India, right? But in India, they're like incredibly strict about how quickly you report
I
on
didn't know that.
security issue, like super short window, like the shortest that I'm aware of. And so they're definitely privacy attorneys can speak to this better, but you have to find some good international ones. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. So yeah, you kind of need to know that landscape. And if you can err on the side of caution, you're going to be in a better position.
Yep. All right, let's get to this next setting here. We got about 20 minutes left and only 4 settings, so we're making great time here. But import saved passwords from default browser on first run. I mean, I can see the convenience, especially, new employee, whatnot, right? You're onboarding their machine, but what opportunity does this maybe open up for the bad guys?
Well, first of all, this is assuming that you've been saving your passwords in a browser.
This is true. That's a different setting from another episode.
So, I guess somehow if you've gotten through that part of your life and doing that, which you absolutely should not do.
Chris,
Uh,
your parents have your family,
oh,
brothers, sisters,
oh,
are they saving
oh,
passwords to the
oh,
browser?
don't get me started with my parents. My problem is the answer is no. That's why my dad has like 25 Facebook accounts because he spins up another one because he can't get into it.
I only bring that up because I recently got my mom and dad onto a password manager and even set up MFA on Amazon and the critical ones, and that was a process.
My dad's no spring chicken, so I spent a lot of time there trying to get into stuff. But anyway, but yeah, this is the same type of deal. I mean, again, you're having passwords passing from point A to point B without knowing if there's anything in between. Um, you also, again, I think that the importance here is you're assuming that any of those saved passwords are good passwords, and
Yep.
you're just giving them an excuse to keep using weak passwords. So yeah, I mean, password hygiene, training people on proper
Yep.
passwords, making sure you do a multi-factor passwordless stuff, passkeys, all that type of stuff. That's not for this episode. That's where
Yep.
the going. So I mean,
Might
we
be something we talk about. We have Tara Wheeler coming on in a few weeks, and I know with her platform, Red Queen, I think there's a third word to it, Red Queen Dynamics. But for their login, they don't have a password. They have a passwordless authentication method.
gotcha. Yeah. So that's where I think things can be, especially for parents. If I could figure out, I've been trying to think about that. What could you do that would work for older people? Man,
Yep.
it's tough. Yeah.
Yep, that is a whole episode. And to continue this password conversation, this next setting here is actually something you kind of hinted at, maybe unintentionally, but you don't know which passwords are the good passwords, the bad passwords, right? And this is a complementary setting. If you need to accept the risk, you can exclude certain ones from synchronizing. So introduce a little bit on this one and maybe talk towards complementary controls at a high level.
Yeah, this is an interesting one right here. I mean, again, this is assuming that you want people synchronizing in the first place.
Yep.
You're somewhat promoting this behavior in this particular thing. Um, but I guess the point about this one is you want to, I guess, if you do allow for this to happen, um, you are starting to restrict things from one place to another. My always heartburn with any types of things where you're saying, hey, look, I want to expose things to multiple devices is, do you have control over all those devices at all times? Are you starting to allow people to, are you inadvertently allowing stuff to go to personal devices that maybe you weren't intending to do? In our world today, most companies aren't paying for their employees to have work devices.
Yep.
So there's personal devices. There's, with remote work and everything else, it just gets really kind of nasty.
Which is a static fixed cost. So you'd think company can anyway. Yes, I feel where you're going with that.
Yeah, it's just it's pretty nasty. This is one of those things where you're just like, hey, look, it may just be you don't even want to get this far down. Like if you're having to go this deep and start figuring this type of stuff out, I think you've opened the floodgates already too much.
Yep, absolutely. All right, this next setting here is ensure enable guest mode in browser is set to disabled. So I believe this is likely referring to how Chrome has managed profiles. You sign in with a profile. This is saying, hey, you can't allow anyone else to use this browser. So no guests, nothing else. Is that what this is saying? And why might we not want others to use our browser? If it's kind of segmented off in a way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the point about this one is, and this is where this kind of it gets kind of confusing when you enable disable stuff. And
Yeah.
I know you kind of
Oh
touched it.
yeah, the GPO name. I
Yeah.
hate the
It's kind
phrasing.
of,
So yeah, this by default again, enable is literally the explicit default. So this is saying, hey, you have a friend who needs to go on your computer. They can go on, right? Maybe they don't have the password to your managed profile, but they can still at least create not a temporary,
yeah.
a guest profile and still use it.
Yeah, you just the challenge is whether it's your friend or a staff
Or
person. Yeah, you're allowing them to do some stuff in a way that is outside of the confines of what you want them to do. So no telling them what they're doing. They might try to be using it intentionally to do something bad, or maybe unintentionally they're not paying attention. They're in guest mode and they're doing some stuff they shouldn't be doing. They should be doing under more of a work profile. But yeah, it's just kind of an ugly deal, especially with you just have a person that's maybe not very technical, and you just don't
yeah,
want them to make mistakes. First of all, but the other part is it could make things from an audit perspective more difficult too. So when you're doing
that's
stuff
a
in a
good point.
controlled manner, it's going to be much easier. Yeah, I know this person was working here, and these are the things I'm looking for over this timeline. When stuff is in guest, it's less clear. There's going to be some ambiguity. So unless there's a really legitimate business purpose to do it, don't allow
I think
both.
this is going to be a topic we'll get into with Eric for our next webinar episode. But I mean, at a high level, instead of going in depth, like these configurations and what you were referring there were kind of like change history or audit logs, even, right? How important are those in forensics? How much easier or how much value do those bring to that part of the process?
Yeah, so let's just browser activity. So one of the things, especially with most of the stuff we look at, browser activity is not like a primary artifact, but it is helpful, right?
Okay.
But a lot of times, I mean, we don't get the information we need out of the browsers because it's just not configured the proper way to give us that. So a lot of times we have to tell people, they're like, hey, you're gonna have to go change all your passwords and do all that type of stuff because we have no way of saying whether or not they did anything in your browser or not. So a lot of times it kind of comes down to, can we use some of that? If there's activity there, can we use it to give somebody better direction on what they need to do when they're trying to remediate a situation? But I think the more important part of it is a lot of times people say, hey, I'll need this audit trail for what happened. But what you really got to think about is, no, we really need it more for what didn't happen. Because a lot of questions, especially from the outside, is, well, how do you know that didn't happen? How do
Yeah.
you know that didn't happen? How do you know that's what it comes down to. And so you having the more information and the more evidence you have to support your conclusion and to be able to rule out. And unfortunately, sometimes these people have absolutely no experience, no clue what they're asking. They completely discredit the fact that you have an expert forensics person working on this. So the more information, the more ammunition you have to prove out a conclusion, the quicker you can put things to bed and move on.
You know, you said something that really interested me, and this is me with my sales hat on at this point. But you said browser activity is not the primary place because it's not configured as such. I'm curious, maybe a future practice or exercise we can do. What if it was configured to CIS? Would there be more data? Would there be anything valuable? That would be interesting to me to find out.
Yeah, it would be interesting. It'd be interesting. I'll take it, to my forensics team
Right.
and get their opinion on it as well. But I mean, there is things. I mean, a lot of times we need to figure out why were credentials. Somebody got in. When were those credentials compromised? A lot of times we don't know.
Right.
It's possible that if we could get that information if it existed.
Yeah,
So,
it'd be interesting. This next setting here, I'm actually really glad it was on today's episode because a hot topic in the security world, incognito mode. No one knows, no one sees anything, not even Google,
that's
right?
yeah, yeah. And
Might be a lawsuit going on.
this is a tough one, right? Because there are yeah. There, a lot of times when you get in situations, what does support tell you? Opening something in incognito mode.
Yes, because you got to clear cache because the website needs a refresh and the hard refresh
You
didn't work. Go to
yeah,
incognito.
yeah. And if you're like an MSP, you probably have legit reasons why some of your stuff needs to go in incognito mode. I get it, and there's probably different ways of solving that problem, but I get it. But for let's just say the typical standard person, this is, yeah, it's exactly what it is. It disguises everything that they're doing. So if you have it disabled, it basically gives you more visibility, and that's kind of the balance we have to have here. We're not trying to monitor every step that they're doing in their work life. That's kind of creepy.
Yep.
But at the same time, we don't want things to be a total black spot in some type of timeline that we don't know, and we just need to be able to do it. So if you allow them in incognito mode, you're basically blinding yourself. And from a security perspective, we need visibility.
Yeah. Have you been following at all with, Google actually was tracking this stuff even though they claimed they weren't and all of that story, or is that out of
No,
mind, out of sight for now?
no. I mean, I've seen some indications that that stuff really pisses me off. Like, but so I try not to read too much.
Yeah.
But I mean, it gets to the point now where you're just like, golly, I mean, yeah, I don't want to go like to the extreme one side or the other and say you can't trust any of these guys, but you really can't, because data is what they built their business off of. So thinking that they're not even taking the smallest amount of data and using that for some financial benefit, I mean, you're kidding yourself.
You're
So
kidding
it
yourself. Yep.
doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
You accepted the risk when you went to that. I mean, it is what it is. All right. Last setting for the day. And this is one that, we just talked about forensics a little bit, but if cache size is not set to a high enough number, then of course there's nothing there. But this sounds like just making sure you have a large enough cache, but introduce why cache is important, maybe from the setting perspective, but talk about even the forensic side if there is any.
Yeah, so this is another one of those interesting ones, right? Is you want, so your cache is storing a lot of stuff and can become very valuable in somebody else's hands. So having some limitation on that cache and knowing what that limitation is extremely helpful. There's obviously some performance benefits to this. I would say with today's
Yep.
hardware, not as important but back in the day, this is something that you really paid attention to a lot, because you could really kill a machine and chew up some space. At the same time, you don't want to reduce it down too much to where you may lose some information that could be helpful in an investigative situation. And I would tell you the one thing, and again, that would open up a whole nother rabbit hole that we won't go down to. But I want to tell you one thing that we didn't really talk about is, hey, when it comes to insider activity and suspected, whether it's accidental or malicious insider, the browser is the key. All right, so don't get me wrong. When I said it wasn't for the types of investigations we do, it's not the forefront. But when you're investigating if an employee is sending data to a competitor, or or doing whatever they're doing, or whatever the case may be, is the browser is extremely helpful in that particular situation. And so that's where this stuff matters. And so understanding what that setting is, and understanding why you have it in place and that you can defend that size, that's important.
That is something we're going to have to dive into at the next session, because that one at a high level, makes sense. If there is an insider threat, that browser's everything. But hearing more on that will be fun. All right. We only got a couple minutes left. I'm realizing I was looking at the recording time, but I'm realizing we're right at the end of the hour. So my mind wasn't working right. So let's hit up this second to last slide here. MSPs are constantly maybe talking to their end clients about, attacks, vulnerabilities, risk. All of the settings we talked about here today are mitigating the risk of attack techniques being successful. Chris introduced it, right? They have a process. You break something in that process, they have to pivot. Will they take the time to pivot, or will they move to the next person, right? So this is just a screen of some MITRE attack techniques that are literally mitigated by just the settings we talked about here today. Chris, anything you want to talk about? Maybe you want to dive into one of these, or just talk high level about how the CIS benchmarks do mitigate risk.
Well, I think you mentioned a term earlier, living off the land, that I'm starting to use even more so myself in explaining things to them. And the browser is probably one of the best things to help attackers live off the land, meaning they don't have to install anything. They don't have to do anything new. They just use that browser, or the things connected behind the scenes of the browser, like we talked about cache and those types of things, to get what they need done, or they use it as that entry point in. If they can't get in via email, they'll get in through that browser somehow. And so it's super important. So you don't have to dive into any of those. We talked about
Yeah.
most of them, with the exception of network sniffing. But the MITRE ATT&CK framework, or the techniques, help people understand how things happen across the path, what the attacker used. And so being able to understand how attackers operate, and you're not going to be able to stop the top Chinese hacker out there, but you will make lives miserable for many of them out there. And what I tell people is, yeah, there's going to be some of them that are going to see it as a challenge, but most of them are going to say, hey, this is too much work. I'm going to go find some easier target to go find. So whatever you can do to stop these guys in their tracks, disrupt their processes,
Yeah.
and make them kind of avoid you or do something else is incredibly important. So this slide speaks to that very, very clearly.
I love that you say disrupt the process. I think that's going to be another topic I find to talk about with someone, because that is, if they have a process, if it breaks, it causes headaches, right? All right, let's get this last slide again, just a high level. I know we're wrapping up at the hour, but again, like, why should an MSP be talking to their end client about hardening their browsers? Is this something an MSP should be doing? If it's an MSP looking at doing this for the first time, I mean, what would you say to them? How would you advise them through that process? And let's get this next slide on.
Yeah, so you definitely should be talking to your clients about hardening. And again, it may not be a one size fits all approach, meaning it's not going to fit all your clients and exactly the same. Even with your clients, it may not fit all their employees exactly the same. But let's say you have a client that has a manufacturing floor. I guarantee you, everything we talked about here could probably be enabled for that manufacturing floor.
Yes.
And so same thing with what people working in finance and accounting. I mean, there's going to be some clear benefits to that, but I think the user impact is always what people are going to somewhat push back on. But really, I think what we talked about here in the majority of things, the user impact is going to be minimal, and if it's explained correctly, people will get through that. If you ultimately, people might put up a little stink about something, but they'll get used to it and they'll start typing that address in from going forward. And I think there is what's interesting about this one is there is a cost benefit and there's some operational benefit to this. The more you allow, we can't go back to the world where we restricted everybody to 20 websites that they can go to.
Yep.
I heard somebody say something like the average number of websites people go to is 126. I heard that on an earlier call today. I know that they got that from
That's
USAC or
cool.
somewhere else.
That's a pretty cool stat. It wasn't from me, but now I want to find out.
Yeah, but it's 126 websites. So anyway, and I mean, it was right before this call, so I was like, this is going to work perfectly. I got to fit it in. But the point is we can't restrict people right anymore like we used to at the banks. I mean, you can only go to those websites and that's it. But at the same time, if we can restrict what they can do, and maybe definitely restrict the risk, then less stuff's going to break. People are going to see less weird stuff happening on their computer. So that should ultimately reduce in less calls. Is it going to reduce you down by 100,000 calls a year? No. But anything that you can start to chip away at that, I think it would have some benefit. And I just think going forward, you're starting to, again, instill this security culture, this security philosophy, and people just start to care more about it when you do that. But you have to let them understand it. And that's where the user impact comes. If you teach people and let them know why you're doing this, you're not trying to be just the authoritative
Turn
IT
it all
guy that
on.
says no.
Mhm.
Yeah, you're doing it for a reason. And if you can get that buy-in from top down, you'll be in good shape, in my opinion.
I do think these settings really do increase that security culture and security awareness. It builds that security culture at the business. So very much resonates with me there. And I know we're 3 minutes over, but if there's any additional closing thoughts here, Chris, I mean, anything you really want to leave the audience with outside of those last two things?
Yeah, I just say our world today is a much more swiftly moving world, especially come from security. And we're seeing it, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities, the bad guys are taking advantage of those more quickly than ever. I saw a report, there was a platform that had a vulnerability, and within 22 minutes of it being announced, there was activity. Cloudflare was already detecting activity of it trying to be exploited. So the point is this stuff is incredibly important. Security is it, where we do need people to be productive and we want them to allow them to work, and we will do everything we can to help them do that from the business side of things. But at the same time, we do just need to be more serious about stuff, especially with the browser, because it's such a key component of everybody's life.
Yep. Awesome. Awesome closing thoughts. Thank you for being a guest this week, Chris. And let's go ahead and close up the show here and highlight this final slide with the upcoming schedule. So I mentioned at the beginning, we do have Jared Brantley coming on tomorrow for a talk on automation. And then we are transitioning from Chrome hardening to Edge hardening. So Mark Menzies is a avid Edge user. I was telling him we were doing a Chrome series and he said, absolutely not. So he's kicking off the Edge series for us with content and device access. And then we're going over to Bob Miller after that, who is really making a splash with the IR games that I'm happy to be a part of myself.
He's
and
awesome.
as
All
yeah,
those
he's
guys are great. Yeah.
the group is doing amazing things. It's been a lot of fun working with him. And Senteon, again, as a gift to you guys, if you do want to reach out via our website, just let us know, settings webinar, let us know you watched, and we are happy to provide some free assessments that are internal or external, so you can actually see your security posture and see where you fit with these regulations. So thank you so much for the time, Chris. We will have you on again very soon for that part 2.
All right. Sounds good, Zach.